There's a new command and control technique used to bypass firewall traffic filtering.
Hey Tom, I hear you have a very interesting story for us today.
Yeah, hey guys. There's an interesting article that recently came out that I was going to talk about. It's actually a new command and control technique that's being used to bypass firewall rules that I thought was pretty interesting. It really kind of stuck out to me as something that was a noteworthy kind of evolution of malicious activity. So the article is actually written by Sophos, specifically their labs team. And basically what they discovered was there was this adversary that was hiding out within various cloud infrastructure networks owned by private organizations. And they were essentially using a custom toolkit, malware toolkit, to piggyback C2 traffic onto legitimate traffic that was bound for the web server. So this was discovered on AWS, which is the big leader in cloud. However, this technique most notably can also be used for typical on-prem network infrastructure or standard networks around the world rather than just cloud. So while it may have been observed on AWS, it's actually a technique that I think is pretty noteworthy just because it's something we can see in almost any as a threat to almost any organization right now. But basically, it's not operating system specific for the most part. There are sections of this toolkit that are built for Windows operating systems and Linux as well. But to give more detail, basically what these guys found was that the attacker was able to basically reach victim machines inside the network by sending requests to a public-facing web server through the firewall, of course, and the firewall in that case is allowing it because it's just typical inbound web traffic. However, on that web server, there's a rootkit installed that's actually intercepting that traffic after it goes through the firewall and basically transferring that into malicious command and control activity, forwarding it over to a backdoor that's inside the network. So it's specially crafted web requests that, from a defender's perspective, look nothing more than just kind of like typical requests that'll just get dropped at the web server because they're invalid. But they're making it through the firewall. So it's an interesting technique because it's mainly geared towards bypassing the firewall, and can be used for back and forth communication. And from a defender's perspective, it really kind of comes down to hunting for very anomalous web traffic. Because you're seeing just internal systems talking to your web server. From the outside, you're just saying standard web traffic going to and from the web server.
Shows ingenuity on the part of the adversaries. At the same time, it's kind of scary because it's such an advanced technique.
So it's pretty tricky to defend against. These guys found it through anomalous traffic hunting. So it's not something that you can really see through like IDS signatures or anything like that. So a lot of the detection capabilities that are for something like this appear to be isolated around some basic IOCs, but mostly log details. So that's pretty interesting. But the challenge this kind of presents for defenders is pretty complex because it's a more advanced and complex attack toolkit that doesn't require just a single piece of malware, but rather a whole suite of malware. So, there's not just it's not a simple hash you can detect. There's a whole toolkit that is a bit more complex to try and hunt down. So these guys actually assessed that this was a part of likely a nation state sponsored attack group, mainly because of the complexity, but also because of the toolkit they've used, which is related to the bespoke toolkit. If you're not familiar with it, it's pretty interesting. But yeah, I think, in my opinion, I think this is something that we're going to start to see a bit more as time continues. As something like this is seen as successful through the eyes of other adversaries, it could be, taken on as a potential attack method for others as well.
So is it the case that they didn't really compromise the web server per se? They got something that runs at a lower level and intercepts that connection before it ever gets to the web server?
Yeah, exactly. There's the piece that's kind of intercepting it on the way to the web server is actually what they call the listener, and that's really just kind of deobfuscating the C2 traffic and sending it to the actual backdoor that's on a separate system internally. The infrastructure behind how it all works is a bit complex, so I definitely recommend folks checking out the article that we'll link. But yeah, it's a pretty interesting technique, and there's a whole category of different capabilities that are spread across different specific tools itself.
So it's almost like a port knocking thing in a way, similar to like some of the port knocking type techniques.
Yeah, it definitely reminded me of that. It has that vibe of a lot of the old school attacks, but it's interesting just because I haven't seen something like this in quite a while, rather than doing something like web shells. Web shells are super popular right now for attackers to use, but this one's just clearly bypassing through, forged requests that the firewall would typically, they would try and block with a firewall or a proxy or something, but this sneaks right by, which is pretty interesting.
Right. Go ahead.
Do you know which part of the stack, I guess, where were they hiding the traffic? Was it at like the IP layers or TCP layer, or right at the application layer?
Right at the application layer, I believe. And I think it depends on exactly what they're trying to do, if it's just a beacon or if it's actual data exfiltration. I think the data exfiltration side of the house kind of steps up the game from what I can tell. The article actually has a pretty amusing graphic to kind of explain it all, because there's so many moving pieces to this whole thing, which is pretty funny.
Right. Yeah, I guess it's pretty advanced to be able to, I guess, intercept traffic on a box right between different layers, the operating system and...
Especially when there's another process that's bound to that port listening.
Yeah.
Right, so you're...
It's definitely like a rootkit thing, which is what you mentioned. It's a rootkit. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. Very advanced technique for sure. It actually reminds me of like steganography techniques, I think, where you like hide something in an image. It's almost like in plain sight.
Right.
You could see it, but you don't know it's really there unless you know like maybe the decoding algorithm and stuff like that. So yeah, pretty impressive technique from the bad guys here.
And I'm assuming the adversary would have had to implant this via some other means, probably, right? They got to get it onto that web server somehow, and then use that as kind of their exfiltration point and command and control point.
They weren't able to confirm exactly how these networks were actually compromised to lead up to implementing all this whole tool set, but they think it may have been unauthorized remote access through something like SSH that allowed them to initially kind of break into the network to deploy all of this.
Right. So I guess the moral of the story is, if your web logs on your actual web server don't jive with what your network, traffic collection looks like, then something's wrong, right?
Yes.
Like if I can see it in the network traffic, but the web server doesn't know it ever happened, even though I know that's the web server, that would be an interesting, I'm sure that would how it would stand out, but
yeah. I guess it's important to make sure that you're kind of monitoring both ends then.
Right.
You want to make sure you're monitoring the logs on the server itself and something you have at the network layer, just so that the rootkit can't impact it.
Right.
Interesting.
All right, cool.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks, Tom.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah,
This is an example of where it's important to have a layered approach to protection. So you should always be collecting like web application logs or web logs. But at the same time, to be protected against this threat, you're going to want to make sure you have an external monitoring solution that looks at your network, maybe a WAF, a firewall proxy or reverse proxy that can log for you things independently of the operating system. So if you did have such a like let's say a Trojan or rootkit on that server, you would at least be able to detect it via your network monitoring.